got a couple of generals here that are in agreement, but a number of your colleagues, General Bradley, are dovish, or at least would disagree with your views. How do you explain that division among professional military men?
This guy was the mastermind behind daring counterattacks that saved German forces from disaster. Another thought fast under pressure, building shelters from frozen ground to save his men from the deadly cold. But these men weren't just battlefield heroes. Their stories are filled with victories, defeats, and moral complexity. Today, we're uncovering the untold stories of 5 of Germany's greatest generals you've never even heard of. First up at number 5, Hermann Balck, a general who knew how to win battles through speed, strategy, and bold moves. He wasn't famous like Rommel or Guderian, and he didn't rely on political connections to rise through the ranks. Instead, he earned his reputation through pure battlefield success. His journey began in World War I, where he learned the basics of warfare, but it was in World War II that his talent truly shined. In 1943, German forces on the Eastern Front were in bad shape. After the defeat at Stalingrad, morale was low, and the Soviet army was pushing forward fast. That's when Balck stepped in during the Third Battle of Kharkov, taking charge of the 11th Panzer Division. He launched a sudden counterattack. His plan was precise and daring. He struck the Soviets hard, forcing them into retreat and giving Germany time to recover. This wasn't just a small win. Retaking Kharkov was crucial in slowing the Soviet advance. What made Balck special was how he led his men. Instead of staying back at a headquarters, he was right there with them on the battlefield. He saw what they saw, made decisions in real time, and gave orders based on what was actually happening. His soldiers trusted him because he shared the risks and understood the challenges they faced. He wasn't a distant commander. They saw him as one of their own. Balck was a master of blitzkrieg, Germany's strategy of fast, powerful attacks. But he didn't rely on brute force. He knew when to strike and when to pull back, making sure his tanks and troops hit the enemy where it hurt the most. At Kharkov, he used quick movements and surprise to surround Soviet units and destroy them before they could react. His timing and coordination were key. Every unit worked together, creating chaos for the enemy and turning the battle in Germany's favor. Later in 1944, Balck showed his skill again during the German retreat from France after the D-Day invasion. The Allies had the upper hand, with more troops and total control of the skies. Balck couldn't stop them, but he didn't panic. Instead, he managed a disciplined retreat, slowing down the Allied advance while keeping his men organized and alive. His focus was on minimizing losses, not on chasing unrealistic victories. So why isn't Hermann Balck a household name? The answer is simple. He wasn't interested in fame or politics. He didn't have powerful connections or seek the spotlight. He just did his job, and that's why history often overlooked him. Even after the war, military experts studied Balck's tactics. His ability to adapt, lead from the front, and execute fast, coordinated attacks became models for modern mobile warfare. But while his strategies are still taught in military schools, his name remains largely forgotten. Next at number 4, we have Erhard Raus, a general who could think fast and solve problems when disaster seemed inevitable. Born in Austria-Hungary, Raus worked his way up through the ranks and eventually commanded the 6th Panzer Division during one of the toughest campaigns of World War II, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. By December 1941, his division had reached just 14 kilometers from Moscow, but they were in deep trouble. The freezing winter had set in, supplies were running low, and Soviet forces were launching constant attacks. Many German soldiers were freezing to death before they even had a chance to fight. Raus didn't wait for reinforcements that weren't coming. He acted immediately. He ordered his men to blast holes in the frozen ground and build makeshift shelters to protect themselves from the deadly cold and Soviet fire. It was a simple solution, but it worked. These dugouts saved countless lives and allowed his division to hold their position longer than anyone expected. While other divisions nearby faced collapse, Raus's quick thinking kept his troops alive and fighting. But Raus wasn't just a survival expert. He also knew when to take the offensive. In 1943, during the massive tank battles of Kursk and Kharkov, he faced overwhelming Soviet forces with more tanks, soldiers, and supplies. Many commanders might have panicked, but Raus stayed calm. At Kursk, he realized a direct victory wasn't possible, so he carefully timed small counterattacks to weaken the enemy while protecting his forces from being overrun. At Kharkov, the situation was even worse. The Soviets were advancing quickly, and German units were crumbling under the pressure. But Raus remained focused. He organized a retreat to the Dnieper River, making sure his troops didn't fall apart along the way. Instead of a chaotic retreat, Raus's men set traps and launched surprise ambushes to slow the Soviet advance. His leadership was so effective that his forces not only escaped, but they remained intact and ready for future battles. Raus's strength came from his practical approach. He didn't take unnecessary risks or blindly follow orders if they didn't make sense. He adapted to the situation and made decisions based on what was happening in real time. This flexibility made him one of the most dependable commanders on the Eastern Front. After the war, Raus dedicated himself to sharing what he had learned. His book, Panzer Operations, became a key resource for understanding how to use tanks effectively in battle. At number 3, we have Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's smartest defensive commanders. Unlike many generals, Heinrici stayed away from politics. He didn't join the Nazi Party and often clashed with Nazi leaders because of his strong Christian beliefs. But his talent on the battlefield was too great to ignore. During the harsh Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1941 and 42, when German forces were barely holding on, Heinrici's smart defensive tactics helped slow the Soviet advance and stopped a total collapse. Heinrici's strategy was simple but effective. Instead of making his men stay in one place and fight to the death, he created several layers of defense. His troops could fall back, regroup, and counterattack when needed. This flexible approach saved lives and bought time to reorganize. When leading the retreat from Smolensk, Heinrici showed how important this strategy was. Instead of following bad orders, he focused on keeping his soldiers alive so they could keep fighting later. In 1945, during the final days of the war, Heinrici faced his biggest challenge. He was in charge of Army Group Vistula as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. But Heinrici saw that the city couldn't be saved. Instead of wasting thousands of lives, he ordered his troops to retreat across the Oder River. This decision saved many soldiers but angered Hitler, who dismissed him from his command. Heinrici's legacy is special because he knew how to balance strategy with common sense. He wasn't a commander who blindly followed orders. He knew when to fight and when to pull back to protect his men. In a war filled with destruction, Heinrici stood out as a general who used both his brain and his heart to make decisions. Now, at number 2, let's talk about Walter Wenck, often referred to as Germany's boy general, because of how young he was when he rose to prominence. But don't let his age fool you. Wenck was a seasoned strategist who made one of the most significant contributions in the final days of the war. By 1945, Germany was on the brink of collapse, and the Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. Wenck was put in charge of the 12th Army, positioned west of the city, with the task of defending against the advancing Western Allies. But Wenck quickly realized that Berlin couldn't be saved. Instead, he made a decision that would define his legacy. Rather than throwing his men into a hopeless battle, Wenck redirected his efforts towards rescuing civilians and soldiers trapped in the city. He established a defensive perimeter and orchestrated a series of evacuations, helping tens of thousands of people escape westward to American-held territory. His famous order to his troops, "We're not fighting for Berlin or the Reich anymore. We're fighting to save lives," showed his humanity in a war that had long abandoned it. After the war, Wenck was captured by American forces but was released in 1947. Even after offers to take on high-ranking positions in post-war Germany, he chose to retire from public life, leaving behind a legacy of compassion amid chaos. Finally, at number 1, we come to Hermann Hoth, a general whose military skill is hard to ignore, but whose legacy is clouded by the atrocities committed under his command. Hoth was a master of armored warfare and proved it during Operation Barbarossa, where he led large-scale tank offensives with precision and speed. His leadership in the Third Battle of Kharkov and the Battle of Kursk showed how well he could adapt to the chaos of battle. He wasn't the kind of general to stick to rigid plans. He knew when to change tactics, making him a key figure in some of Germany's most significant battles. But Hoth's story isn't just about battlefield victories. His legacy is complicated by the war crimes committed by units under his command, particularly in the Soviet-occupied territories. Anti-partisan operations often went beyond targeting enemy fighters and resulted in mass killings of civilians. This darker side of his service makes it difficult to separate his military success from the human suffering it caused. Even with these troubling aspects, Hoth's contributions to military strategy are still studied in military academies around the world. His ability to command large formations of tanks and infantry, execute complex maneuvers, and respond to enemy counterattacks was impressive. But as history has shown, success on the battlefield is only part of a general's legacy. After the war, Hoth was tried for war crimes and sentenced to prison. His case is a reminder of the moral conflicts faced by military leaders under the Nazi regime. While Hoth's tactical brilliance is remembered, so too is the price that came with it, making his legacy a cautionary tale of how even great military minds can be tied to great atrocities. That's all for 5 greatest German generals you've probably never heard of. If you're interested in more fascinating history content, make sure to click on the next video.